Hi everyone, welcome or welcome back to Misinformation in Science and Society. Here to listen, not to judge. I'm your host Annie, and today with us we have Regina Rini. All right, welcome. So could you please introduce yourself a little bit and what you do?
Hi, my name is Regina Rini. I teach in the philosophy department at York University in Toronto, Canada, and I teach classes on the social impacts of technology.
Yeah. So why did you choose this career initially?
Sure. I think it's really interesting because it gives me a chance to use different aspects of human knowledge. So I started my career in neuroscience and basically broadly in psychology and brain sciences. And then I moved bit by bit into philosophy because philosophy is a way of connecting the sciences to literature and history, the news, critical discussion of current events. It's a nice way of bringing things together. I think a lot of people think about philosophy as just what a bunch of dead Greek people thought, which it's kind of that, but it's also in large part like how we connect what dead Greek people thought to how we think about what's happening today. And so
Yeah.
that's the kind of thing I enjoy doing.
Mm-hmm. Um, so what's your favorite part of, well, I guess you already kind of talked about it, but what's your favorite part of doing what you do now?
Sure. What I really like doing is working with students to look at some particular problem that we're facing today, whether it's disinformation or an environmental catastrophe or whatever is going on in the news today, and then connecting it to historical texts that you might not expect. So, like, we'll read something from, say, 1960, where they're first starting to think about artificial intelligence, and we'll ask, does some of this hold up? Do we still think 60 years later this is a problem, or do we think the problem's changed? That kind of thing. So that's my favorite is to read together with students texts that are older than I am too. So it's for all of us, it's old stuff, and try to figure out how does it still apply to the modern day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so why do you think that truth is so important?
You've got a cat climbing on me. She just jumped
Oh.
in my lap a second ago. So if I winced, that was why. But go ahead, sorry.
So why do you think truth is so important, and why do you think misinformation is such a big issue right now?
Yeah. So the tricky thing is that we're in a moment where democracy is wobbling. And I don't mean just in the United States or not just Canada. This is true across the world right now, where democratic societies are facing challenges internally, but also to some extent externally. People who are seeking to undermine the legitimacy of democratic countries are trying to interfere in elections and in public debates. And so the real foundation for a democracy to keep going is to have some agreed set of standards for how we figure out what the truth is. We're not going to agree about the end point. Like we're going to end up, we still might not fully agree about what the result is, but at least having some procedures we agree upon that if we follow them, we'll get closer to truth. That's necessary, and that's really under threat right now because of the rise of increasing partisanship and polarization, but also the fact that there are people intentionally interfering in the system to try to make it less likely that we can come to consensus.
Mm. So how do you or people in your field kind of try to tackle or avoid misinformation?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think about it in terms of social norms. So norms are patterns of behavior where you come to expect people will engage in a certain set of behavior, they'll do a certain thing because you know that they expect you to behave that way. So in other words, everybody knows that this is how we behave around here. That's what a norm is. And norms change over time. They're not stable. They change radically, often quite quickly, especially when technology shifts. And so I think looking at the philosophy and the psychology and the sociology of norms helps us think about what kind of norms are being shifted by the technology. So a very, very quick example of that has to do with norms about being held accountable for the information we share with each other. It used to be before social media that if you tell your friend something that's wrong, they're probably going to remember that you misled them. Even if you meant it, even if you were just mistaken, they're probably going to remember you were mistaken, and they might hold you accountable for that. Come
Mm.
to you and say, why did you tell me that? But social media already has changed that because we hear so much information from so many different people that we can't remember anymore who told us what. often. And so it becomes really hard to hold people accountable and hold them to the norm that they are responsible for the things they tell us. And so that already, I think that norm is a good example of one that's already been shaken up and loosened. And so in my view, what we need to do is think of ways of strengthening or rebuilding old norms that will help us in new technology.
Mm. Yeah. So, what do you think is like the worst type of misinformation then? What are they like misleading, about like political stuff and yeah.
Yeah, so I'll say there's two types here.
Hmm.
One is about anything that's intended to play on hatred, especially hatred of minority groups. And this is not an accident. It's very easy to stir people up to anger by picking on a group that is already disliked. There are very clear examples of this in Russia in the last 10 years, where Russian disinformation, people who spread disinformation, I have a word here, disinformers, people who spread disinformation were picking on gay people in Russia. So a lot of misinformation about being LGBTQ in Russia. In the West, especially in the United States in the last few years, there's been a lot of disinformation about Muslims. So basically people pick on a category that is already distrusted or disliked unfairly by the majority, and then spread false information about that group, not necessarily to hurt that group. You might want to hurt them too, but more importantly, you want to, if you're the disinformer, you want to use that existing distrust to get people to buy into your disinformation and listen to you more. And so it's a kind of really ruthless and cruel exploitation of the fact that some people are already facing difficulty. So that's the first big problem. The
Hmm.
second big problem, kind of related, but possibly separate, has to do with intentionally using disinformation to pick on democracy. And what I mean here is democracy only works if we all think that we are all in it together, and then we're all qualified to make choices. So like it only works for us to deliberate together and vote together if I believe that you are smart enough to vote and you believe that I'm smart enough to vote and think about it. But disinformation peddlers will sometimes deliberately try to get you to think that the other people in your country or in your state or whatnot are stupid. They want you to think these people fall for stupid things on the internet, therefore they're not smart enough to vote, therefore democracy is not a legitimate form of government. It's a very intentional attack on the assumption that we can all work together. And that, I think, has been deliberate over the last 5 to 10 years. And that's the scariest one to me.
Mm. Yeah. So, what do you think would be like the best way for like regular people to like eliminate or avoid, reduce misinformation themselves? Um, like instead like because like sometimes like, a lot of times like big organizations and platforms are like a big part of the issue. But what is something like for example like I can do to yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good question. You're absolutely right that these are both parts of the discussion. We have to worry about the platforms and governments. We also have to worry about people. So I think the number one thing to do is to pay attention to sources. This might sound like common sense, but it actually, when you think about it on social media, it's actually quite hard to do. So if you're watching TikTok and you like the TikTok video comes on and somebody wants to tell you about something or other they heard, they probably aren't going to tell you exactly where they heard it, or they say, I don't remember, I heard this, or they're going to say, I saw somewhere else on TikTok, or I saw a YouTube video. And if they're not telling you where it came from, then that already should be a really big warning sign. Now, like I said, it sounds like common sense, and I get that it's actually kind of hard to follow this advice, because what are you going to do? Are you going to do the research and dig around for hours and hours and hours and find the source for every single claim you see on TikTok or on Instagram or on YouTube? Probably not. So it's quite hard to do this individually. So my advice is to just be judicious, be thoughtful about your attention. So if somebody's saying some garbage or they're speculating and you don't know where they're getting it from, if you don't have time to look into it, then a good default answer is probably don't believe them. And if you do have time to look into it, then, focus on the ones that really matter. Like if there was a political candidate you thought about supporting, and then somebody says something bad about this person, you're like, now I'm not so sure I want to support this person. That's a good place to focus your attention, to actually go dig around and find out, is there some independent corroboration of this rumor you've been told? So that's basically it. The worrying part here is there's not a huge amount we can do individually. we kind of have to work together because each of us alone can't research every single possible thing people say online.
Yeah, for sure. Um, so yeah, those are all my questions I have for misinformation. So is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I think you did a good job of covering the big questions.
Thank you. So now I just have like two more like fun questions kind of. So the first one is what are some of your like inspirations? Like what inspires you in like life, whether that's like a person, book, idea, anything.
Sure. For me, a big part of inspiration comes from history. And I mean that broadly. I like to read a lot of different history, especially in the last century or so. People I can think of as being kind of like us, but not so far back that I don't understand them anymore. And just see how, like, over and over and over again, people see new problems they think of as, how are we going to handle this? When radio was first invented a century ago, pretty much 100 years ago now is when people started buying radios.
Mhm.
Everybody was worried. Radio is very scary. Radio is stirring up the masses. And it was actually true. Radio was used by the fascists in Europe. It was one of Hitler's favorite inventions. Radio was kind of dangerous at the time, but people
Mhm.
eventually figured out ways of handling it and reducing the danger caused by this new technology. So for me, that I find that inspiring, is to look at examples from history of times when other people, when our ancestors and people in the past were just as worried about change as a lot of us are right now, and say, okay, they've figured out ways. We don't know how to do it yet for our moment, but they eventually will figure something out. That I find reassuring and inspiring.
Yeah, yeah, that's really cool. And yeah, so and last question, do you have any advice for people, especially like teens, about like anything?
Yeah. So I'll say, especially for teens, especially for young people, I mean, the truth of it is that you are the best equipped to manage what's going to happen next. And I say this as somebody who was a teen a couple decades ago, and was on the early internet. Like, this was a thing that adults at the time
Mhm.
didn't think was a serious thing. And I was like, well, this is interesting. And I could kind of see how it was going to change society in small ways, but I didn't know the big picture. But I saw the small ways. And so over the course of the last couple of decades, I've been watching things change and look more and more and more like what seemed originally to be this strange little esoteric habit on the internet.
Oh,
And my guess is right now, teens right now are seeing things about how the digital world works that are just not going to be visible to me or to older people, because we're not living in it at the same degree every day. So I actually think that's a reason to think that, you may not have power as a teenager to change things yet, but you actually probably have more knowledge of what's going on the day-to-day ground level than most adults do. And so hanging on to that as you get older and as you start to gain some power and some voice in what happens around you, as you get to be able to vote and to speak up and to write for write for whatever venues are available. I was going to say op-eds. I don't know if there'll be newspaper op-eds in 10 years, but right, get your voice out there in whatever way is available. Having held on to insights you gain early on can be really, really helpful with that. So anyway, my upshot here is, like, being a young person, being a teen is actually not a limitation when it comes to technology. It probably gives you a kind of advantage over the next couple decades.
yeah, all right. Thank you for that. And thank you for this whole interview and for making time. It was really great. It was really fun talking to you and thank you for sharing your insights and stuff.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much for the really interesting questions. It was fun meeting you.
Thank you. All right. Take care.
Bye. You too.